Welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving into a pretty fascinating journey back in time today. For decades, the story of human history has been pitched to us as this perfectly straight line of progress. We always picture our ancient ancestors as these nomadic hunters just struggling to survive, right? Up until someone brilliantly plants a seed. Presto, we get bread, we build towns, and we just march triumphantly toward modern civilization. It's always been framed as the ultimate success story. But what if that massive turning point actually contains some surprisingly dark chapters for the very people who lived through it?
Was farming our biggest mistake? I know, it sounds totally crazy, right? Obviously, agriculture ultimately gave us civilizations, modern technology, and basically the world as we know it today. But when we actually dig into the archaeological and biological data from the early days of farming, the true cost of human progress creates some serious cognitive dissonance. What if the very thing that allowed our species to conquer the globe also absolutely wrecked the individual health of early farmers and forced them into back-breaking labor?
Section 1. The New Stone Age. Okay. Before we unpack all the controversies and the consequences, let's set the stage and figure out exactly what period of human history we're actually talking about here.
So, the word Neolithic actually comes from two Greek words, neos meaning new and lithos meaning stone, literally the New Stone Age. About 12,000 years ago, humanity began this monumental shift. After living exclusively as highly mobile, nomadic hunter-gatherers in these small, tight-knit groups, human beings just started to settle down in one place. They began growing crops and raising animals, which marked the final period of the Stone Age. And this era lasted all the way until people started making bronze tools around 3000 BC.
Section 2. Why did it happen? Now, it's a really common myth that one day someone just woke up with the genius idea to start a farm. In reality, there was no single cause for the Neolithic Revolution. Instead, a kind of perfect storm of several factors came together to encourage humans to change their entire way of life.
Around 14,000 years ago, the last ice age wrapped up and the Earth started to warm up. This warming trend meant wild plants like wheat and barley were suddenly growing much more abundantly, especially over in the Middle East. At the exact same time, human populations were growing, and hunting-gathering could really only support small groups. Add in some intellectual advances, human brains developing new ways of thinking, creating art, and making much more complex tools, and people were perfectly primed to figure out how to plant and care for crops to feed larger, settled communities.
Section 3. Settling down. And this leads us to a really fascinating early shift. People actually began building permanent homes even before they fully mastered agriculture.
In a region known as the Fertile Crescent, that's located right between the Mediterranean Sea and the Persian Gulf, there was this group of people called the Natufians. They noticed wild wheat and barley just growing naturally all around them. So, instead of constantly moving, they began settling down in permanent houses just to stay near those reliable food sources. Over time, they transitioned from merely collecting the wild seeds to actually planting them themselves. This whole desire to stay put led to some incredible early towns. Take Çatalhöyük in Turkey, a settlement that is an astounding 9,500 years old. Imagine as many as 8,000 people living together in these tightly clustered mud brick houses. The architecture was actually so densely packed that there were no streets at all. People literally walked across the structures and entered their homes through holes in the roof. It was just a completely new way for humans to live together.
Section 4. The Agricultural Health Bottleneck. Okay, so humanity settles down, figures out agriculture, and starts producing food. You would absolutely think this would lead to a golden age of human health, right? I mean, a steady food supply has to be better than chasing wild game. Well, prepare for a surprisingly dark turn in our biological history.
There is a remarkably stark contrast in daily diets between these two eras. Hunter-gatherers ate a highly varied diet based on whatever they could forage or hunt on any given day. Early farmers, on the other hand, relied heavily on a very limited number of staple crops. Their diet was far less varied, and this massive dietary shift had some immediate and, honestly, bizarre physical consequences.
And this data is genuinely astonishing. Listen to this. Early farmers were about 5 to 6 inches shorter than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. Scientists have actually studied ancient skeletons and found that the transition to farming caused human heights to completely plummet. The combination of a less varied diet and completely different living conditions took a massive biological toll on the human body.
So why did they shrink so dramatically? Well, beyond just having a limited diet, it was because early farming was quite literally backbreaking work. While hunting and gathering certainly had its dangers, early agriculture required immense, sustained physical labor. Clearing land, planting, watering, harvesting, and processing grain by hand day after day, it was absolutely exhausting. They traded a highly mobile life for grueling, incredibly repetitive work. But here is a truly incredible twist for you. You probably assumed that farming gave us bread, right? Actually, scratch that. The first bread was baked over 14,000 years ago. That means nomadic hunter-gatherers were baking bread long before anyone ever planted a dedicated field of wheat. They were out there harvesting wild grains and figuring out early processing techniques well before the agricultural revolution truly took hold.
Despite that harsh physical toll, humans pushed forward, completely altering the natural world in the process. They selectively bred plants that were easier to harvest, like they found wheat that stubbornly stayed on the stem instead of falling to the ground when it was ripe. They also tamed wild boars into domestic pigs and domesticated wild goats, sheep, and cattle. These animals quickly became absolutely crucial for meat, milk, wool, and heavy labor.
Section 5. New Technologies and Monuments. With permanent settlements and domesticated food sources secured, human ingenuity just exploded in completely new directions.
People started swapping out their rough, chipped stone tools for these smooth, polished stone implements, which is a true hallmark of the Neolithic era. They also invented pottery, which was absolutely vital for securely storing their new surplus of food and water. And to process all that newly domesticated wheat and barley, they developed really heavy grinding stones, turning those tough grains into edible flour.
And because people were finally anchored to one spot, they started building for the long term. They didn't just stop at mud brick houses, they constructed massive, enduring monuments. This is the exact era that gave us Stonehenge in England and the incredible tomb of Newgrange in Ireland. These monumental structures prove that early farming communities were becoming highly organized and deeply invested in their shared cultural and spiritual landscapes.
Section 6. The Legacy of Farming. So, we've covered a lot of ground here, looking at both the fascinating innovations and the shocking physical tolls of this era. Which brings us to our final section, exploring how the shift fundamentally revolutionized the entire globe. Farming wasn't just invented by one group in the Middle East who then kindly taught the rest of the world. No, it was a global phenomenon. While the Fertile Crescent was an early hotspot, agriculture actually developed independently in completely disconnected regions. People in China started growing rice and millet. In Central America, they cultivated maize. Down in the Andes Mountains, they began growing potatoes. This happened in multiple places without any contact between them whatsoever.
Which brings us to a really pivotal number, 12,000. Around 12,000 years ago, humanity made a definitive choice. We traded our nomadic freedom for settled communities. And despite the massive physical drawbacks, the grueling labor, and that initial drop in human stature and health, farming allowed far larger groups of people to live together. It was the absolute engine that transformed small bands of wanderers into villages, towns, and eventually sprawling civilizations.
Which leaves us with one final lingering question. The Neolithic transition wasn't a sudden, magical leap forward, nor was it a simple mistake. It was a complex, really messy compromise. We gained the capacity for immense cities, incredible technology, and modern society. But those achievements were built directly on the backs of early pioneers who endured shrinking health and backbreaking labor. As you go about your day in our modern agricultural world, I want you to ask yourself, we clearly know what we gained, but do we fully appreciate the cost those early farmers paid? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time.